The peace deal is dead. Not stalled, not delayed, not being renegotiated. Dead. Iran sent its response to the United States proposal yesterday through Pakistani mediators. And what they sent back was not a counter-proposal, not a request for modifications, not an opening for further talks. What Iran sent back was a rejection of every single major term in the framework the United States spent weeks constructing. And I need you to understand what that means, because the media is reporting this as just another round of diplomatic back and forth. And it is not. This is the end of the diplomatic track. President Trump called Iran's response unacceptable. That is a direct quote, unacceptable. And when an American president uses that specific word in the context of negotiations with an adversary, it is not a negotiating position. It is a door closing. It is the moment when diplomacy transitions from active process to failed exercise. And what comes after failed diplomacy in a conflict where thousands of people have already died and the Strait of Hormuz remains functionally closed is not more diplomacy. It is more war. Let me be very clear about what just happened, because the implications of Iran's rejection extend far beyond the immediate question of whether talks continue. What Iran rejected was not just a specific set of terms. What Iran rejected was the entire framework for ending this war on anything other than its own terms. And the terms Iran is demanding, the conditions Iran says are necessary for any settlement, are conditions the United States and Israel cannot accept without fundamentally reordering their strategic positions in the Middle East. Having spent decades analyzing how wars end and how diplomatic processes succeed or fail, I can tell you that what we just witnessed is the collapse of the last realistic pathway to a negotiated settlement in the near term. And that collapse has consequences that will unfold over the coming days and weeks in ways that make the conflict we have seen so far look restrained by comparison. Now, let me walk you through exactly what Iran rejected and what Iran is demanding instead, because understanding the gap between those two positions tells you why this breakdown was probably inevitable and why the path forward is so dangerous. The United States proposal, mediated by Pakistan and developed through weeks of indirect negotiations, was built around a sequenced framework. Stage one would involve an immediate cessation of hostilities between U.S. and Iranian forces, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic, and the deployment of international observers to monitor compliance. Stage two would address longer-term issues, including constraints on Iran's nuclear program, limits on ballistic missile development, and a reduction in Iranian support for regional proxy forces. Stage three would involve sanctions relief, normalization of economic relations, and a broader regional security architecture. That framework represented significant concessions from the initial U.S. position. The United States was willing to accept that Iran's nuclear program would not be completely dismantled, only constrained and monitored. The United States was willing to accept continued Iranian influence in Lebanon and Iraq, as long as direct attacks on U.S. forces and Israeli targets stopped. The United States was willing to provide sanctions relief that would allow Iran to rebuild its economy. All of that was on the table. Iran rejected all of it. And what Iran demanded instead tells you everything about how Tehran assesses its strategic position and what it believes it can extract from this conflict. According to reports from Iranian state media and sources familiar with the negotiations, Iran's response included demands for full reparations for damage caused by U.S. and Israeli strikes during Operation Epic Fury. Iran demanded explicit recognition that it was the victim of unprovoked aggression and that the United States bears legal and financial responsibility for the consequences. Iran demanded complete control over navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, with no international oversight or enforcement mechanisms. Iran demanded that any framework treat Iranian security concerns, including the presence of U.S. forces in the Gulf and Israeli military capabilities, as equivalent threats requiring equivalent constraints. Those are not negotiating positions. Those are maximalist demands designed to establish Iran as the party dictating terms rather than accepting them. And the gap between what the United States offered and what Iran is demanding is not a gap that gets bridged through additional rounds of talks. It is a gap that reflects fundamentally incompatible visions of what a settlement would look like. Let me break down why each of Iran's core demands is unacceptable to the United States and why that makes continued negotiation pointless in the current environment. The demand for reparations positions Iran as the aggrieved victim entitled to compensation for damages inflicted during what Iran characterizes as unprovoked aggression. According to sources familiar with the Iranian response, Tehran is requesting financial compensation not just for direct military damage, but for economic losses caused by the closure of oil exports, for civilian casualties, and for what Iran describes as war crimes committed during the targeting of nuclear facilities and civilian infrastructure. The dollar amounts being discussed, according to leaks from the negotiating process, are in the range of $200 to $300 billion. The United States cannot accept that framing without implicitly admitting that Operation Epic Fury was an act of aggression rather than a legitimate response to Iranian threats. No American administration, regardless of party or political orientation, is going to pay Iran hundreds of billions of dollars for damage caused by strikes that the U.S. government justified as necessary for national security and that were conducted, in the U.S. view, in accordance with international law. That demand is a non-starter, not just because of the money, but because of what accepting it would mean about the legal and moral status of American military action. The demand for full control of the Strait of Hormuz without international oversight gives Iran unilateral authority over one of the world's most critical choke points for energy transit. Approximately 21% of global petroleum liquids pass through Hormuz. Any disruption affects prices worldwide within hours. Iran is demanding not just the right to control navigation, which international law already grants to the extent that Hormuz passes through Iranian territorial waters, but the right to do so without any international monitoring, verification, or enforcement mechanisms that could limit Iranian discretion. Iran is asking for the ability to open and close the strait based entirely on its own assessment of its security situation, with no recourse for affected parties. The United States has maintained for decades that freedom of navigation through international waters is a core national interest that cannot be subject to the approval of any single state. Accepting Iranian control over Hormuz on the terms Iran demands would represent a strategic concession so profound that it would undermine American credibility with every ally and partner that depends on U.S. security guarantees for maritime access. That demand is unacceptable, not just to the United States, but to every major economy that depends on energy imports through the Gulf. The demand that U.S. military presence in the Gulf be treated as equivalent to Iranian military capabilities and subject to equivalent constraints asks the United States to withdraw forces that have been stationed in the region for decades, protecting allies and maintaining stability. Iran is asking the United States to leave. The United States is not leaving. That demand is a non-starter. So what we have is a situation where Iran has taken the framework the United States offered, rejected every major component, and substituted demands that require the United States to accept strategic defeat in exchange for ending a war that the United States does not believe it lost. That is not a basis for negotiation. That is a fundamental mismatch in assessments of the strategic balance. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because what I am about to explain, why Iran believes it can make these demands, and what happens when both sides in a conflict believe they are negotiating from positions of strength, is critical to understanding where this goes next. Subscribe, because the decisions being made in the next 72 hours will determine whether we are looking at a return to full-scale war or a prolonged stalemate that nobody can resolve. Now, let me tell you why Iran believes it has the leverage to make maximalist demands and why that assessment, however flawed it might appear from a Western perspective, is driving Iranian decision-making. Iran survived Operation Epic Fury. That is the core of Iran's strategic self-assessment. The United States and Israel launched the most intensive military campaign against Iran in the history of the Islamic Republic. They killed the supreme leader. They destroyed significant portions of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. They degraded Iran's military capabilities, and the regime did not fall. Iran did not capitulate. Iranian forces continued launching missiles throughout the campaign. The Strait of Hormuz remained closed, and when the operation concluded on May 5th, Iran was still standing. From Tehran's perspective, that survival under maximum pressure demonstrates resilience that entitles Iran to negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness. Iran endured what the United States could throw at it and remained functional. That creates a belief within Iranian leadership that the correlation of forces is not as unfavorable as Washington assumes, and that Iran can extract better terms by holding firm rather than accepting a framework built on American assumptions of superiority. Iran also assesses that time is on its side, economically and politically. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is imposing costs on the global economy that create pressure on the United States to settle. Every day that oil prices remain elevated, every day that supply chains remain disrupted, every day that energy-dependent economies in Europe and Asia face shortages is a day that increases international pressure on Washington to find a solution. Iran believes that pressure will eventually force the United States to make concessions that are currently off the table. Iran further assesses that American domestic political constraints limit how long Trump can sustain military operations without clear progress toward objectives. Trump campaigned on ending wars, not expanding them. The longer the conflict drags on without resolution, the more politically vulnerable Trump becomes to criticism that he is trapped in another Middle Eastern quagmire. Iran believes that political pressure will eventually force Trump to accept terms he currently rejects in order to claim credit for ending the war. All of those assessments have elements of truth, but they also reflect a fundamental misreading of American decision-making under pressure. Iran is betting that the United States will choose concession over escalation when the diplomatic track fails. What Iran may not fully appreciate is that the United States also has the option of choosing escalation over concession, and the collapse of diplomacy makes that option more likely, not less. Trump called Iran's response unacceptable. That is not just rhetoric. That is a signal that the United States is not going to bend to Iranian demands. And when the United States does not bend, the pressure that was supposed to force American concessions starts redirecting toward other outlets, military outlets. Let me tell you what the options are now that the diplomatic track has collapsed, because both sides are going to have to make decisions in the coming days about how to proceed in an environment where negotiations are no longer viable. The United States can accept the stalemate, keep the ceasefire in place, maintain the current level of operations, and wait for conditions to change that might make Iran more willing to negotiate on acceptable terms. That is the lowest risk option. It avoids escalation. It preserves the limited stability that the ceasefire has created. But it also means accepting that the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted, that Iran retains its nuclear and missile capabilities with no constraints, and that the conflict remains unresolved indefinitely. That option is politically difficult for Trump, economically costly for the global economy, and strategically unsatisfying for everyone involved. The United States can resume military operations, not a full-scale return to Operation Epic Fury, but targeted strikes designed to increase pressure on Iran and demonstrate that rejecting American proposals has consequences. This could involve strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure to impose economic costs, strikes on remaining missile facilities to degrade capabilities, or strikes on IRGC command nodes to disrupt operations. That option sends a clear message that the United States is not going to accept Iranian intransigence, but it also risks triggering exactly the escalation spiral that diplomacy was supposed to prevent. The United States can go back to Pakistan and try to construct a modified framework that addresses some of Iran's concerns while maintaining core American interests. That option keeps diplomacy alive, but it also signals that American positions are negotiable, even when declared unacceptable, which weakens U.S. credibility in future negotiations. And there is no indication that Iran would accept a modified framework any more readily than it accepted the original proposal. Iran faces its own set of options. Iran can maintain its maximalist position and wait for the United States to make additional concessions under pressure. That is the high-risk, high-reward option. If Iran is correct that time and economic pressure favor its position, holding firm could eventually produce a settlement on favorable terms. But if Iran is wrong, holding firm means prolonged conflict, continued economic deterioration, and the risk that the United States chooses escalation over concession. Iran can soften its position and engage in actual negotiations rather than presenting take-it-or-leave-it demands. That would keep the diplomatic track alive and create opportunities for compromise. But it would also represent a climb down from the maximalist posture Iran just adopted, which would be politically difficult for Iranian leadership to sell domestically after declaring that the U.S. proposal was unacceptable. Iran can escalate militarily to demonstrate that it has options beyond diplomacy. This could involve tightening the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, increasing attacks on Gulf state infrastructure, or launching new missile strikes against Israel or U.S. forces. That option demonstrates resolve and imposes costs on adversaries, but it also increases the likelihood of American military response and could trigger exactly the expanded conflict that Iran claims it wants to avoid. What I want you to understand is that none of these options are good options. They are all variations of bad options with different risk profiles and different potential costs. And the reason we are looking at a menu of bad options is because the diplomatic process that was supposed to produce a good option just collapsed under the weight of incompatible demands and inflexible positions. The peace deal is dead, and what replaces it will be determined by decisions made in Washington and Tehran over the next few days by leaders operating under enormous pressure with limited information and strong incentives to appear tough rather than flexible. Having analyzed how these situations unfold, I can tell you that the most dangerous moment in any conflict is not the beginning, when everyone is still calibrating their moves. It is the moment when diplomacy fails and both sides have to decide whether to accept an unsatisfying stalemate or roll the dice on escalation. That is where we are right now. The media will report this as another setback in negotiations that might be overcome with additional talks. Do not believe that framing. This is not a setback. This is a collapse. The gap between American and Iranian positions is not narrowing, it is widening. And the longer it takes for both sides to acknowledge that reality, the more likely it becomes that the next phase of this conflict will be decided not by diplomats and mediation sessions, but by military planners in situation rooms. If you have stayed with me through this analysis, you understand that the peace deal did not fail because one side or the other was unreasonable. It failed because both sides are operating from strategic assessments that make compromise look like defeat. Iran believes it survived the worst America could deliver and is entitled to terms that reflect that survival. America believes it achieved significant objectives during Operation Epic Fury and is not going to reward Iranian intransigence with concessions that undermine those achievements. Both of those positions have internal logic, and both of those positions are incompatible with settlement. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because this story is entering its most dangerous phase. The ceasefire is holding, but only because neither side has decided to break it yet. The diplomatic track is dead, but nobody has announced what replaces it. And the decisions that will determine whether this war restarts, escalates, or freezes into indefinite stalemate are being made right now, behind closed doors, by people who are under enormous pressure to deliver results that the current situation does not permit. The peace deal just died. Trump called it unacceptable. Iran said no to everything. And what comes next will define the Middle East for years. Pay attention, subscribe, share. Because understanding what just collapsed and why is the only way to understand what happens when the fighting starts again.